And you should be able to start now.
Good afternoon. I'm Julia Brown, and I want to thank Paul O'Connell for inviting me to join you today, and Jane Ash for suggesting the topic related to the Sugar Hill story. As it turns out, and can everybody hear me? I hope I haven't got too much background noise happening here. All right.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
You sound good.
As it turns out, it's a topic that is near and dear to my heart and about which I'm quite passionate. There's no question that construction of highways can have a disproportionate impact on communities of color, ranging from displacement and pollution to preventing residents and businesses from participating in the upside of development. Highway development in cities, historically has exacerbated de facto racial segregation and eliminated or prevented the accumulation of Black and brown wealth. In many cases, the quote unquote urban blight that is allegedly targeted by new road construction was simply code for let's build through the colored neighborhood, often thriving communities. A great body of work shows that urban freeways destroyed the hearts of African American communities in the South Bronx, Nashville, Austin, Los Angeles, Durham, Oklahoma City, and nearly every medium to large American city across the country. Initially, communities of color were targeted because they were least likely to know the law and regulations and least likely to have legal representation to fight City Hall. For example, in Oklahoma City, where I grew up, the first sketch maps of a highway destined to cut through the Northeast Quadrant were drawn a year before I was born. This was the only area where coloreds and Indians, as we were known in those days, were legally allowed to live, hampered by Jim Crow segregation laws and restrictive deed covenants, which prohibited white owners from selling residential properties to colored or Indian buyers. When ODOT, the Oklahoma Department of Transportation, finally began to execute the highway plan some 30 years after those first sketches, when the traffic patterns had reached their projected goals, after Interstate 40 and I-35 were in place, the proposal was to put 3 more major arterials moving traffic in the same direction within a 10-mile radius of one another, disrupting the Black and Native American community, destroying or displacing historic churches, schools, cultural centers, movie theaters, and 3 commercial retail areas. The western edge of this 55-block area bordered the Central Business District. To our south was I-40. To the east was I-35. And to the north, it was bordered by the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Complex and the State Capitol Complex. Now, the right-of-way agents for ODOT would have us believe that this particular tract of land was virtually useless and low value. Well, as a recent law school graduate and the recipient of original Heber Smith Community Law Fellowship, which placed me at Legal Services, I argued that just the opposite was true. The location alone of this particular tract of land had potential reuse because of the proposed interstate and its close proximity to the other areas that I've described, really made it more like the Golden Fleece instead of something that had little value. All the years I was growing up, you'd hear whispers of someday the highway's coming. Over time, People were denied home improvement loans, had insurance policies canceled or premiums increased to the point where they couldn't afford to pay them. There were actually city streets that were unpaved, no sidewalks, no curbs, no storm drains, no street signs. If you can imagine a section of the city adjacent to the central business district and just south of the state capitol complex in that condition, well, the decades took their toll, and the area was sufficiently beaten down by the time they were ready to do the acquisition. Long story short, they first did the first phase of the project, which was the extension of a crosstown highway. And the people who were relocated from the community for that project were relocated to the outskirts of town, to an area that didn't even have city water and sewer. Phases 2 and 3 would physically bisect the community, literally cutting it from one side to the other so that you couldn't access one end to the other without lots of machinations. So I filed a complaint on behalf of the neighborhood with the Civil Rights Division of the Federal Highway Administration. And 2 years later, the state, the county, and the city were found to be in violation of Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and forced to mitigate the adverse impact of the proposed interstate project or lose the 90-10 federal funding that they were counting on to build it. And much like the Century Freeway Mitigation Plan in Los Angeles, the powers that be had no choice but to finally listen to the voices of the community and affected residents and businesses in the path of the interstate. The church I grew up in and still went back to the old neighborhood to attend services was in the path of the freeway. I'll never forget or stop relishing the look on the faces of the ODOT right-of-way officials when they arrived at the church to meet with us. One of them said, "Well, Ms. Brown, what are you doing here?" And I smiled sweetly and with mock surprise said, "Oh, didn't you know that I attend church here and I'm the chairman of the trustee board? And so I have fiduciary responsibility for oversight of the church's properties." They were, to say the least, crestfallen. It didn't take long to get them to withdraw the original paltry offer to purchase they had made and to put the offer on the table which matched the dollar amount that I was requesting. I'll bet to this day my name and face are still painfully etched in their memory banks. In the end, they got their freeway, I-235, but it cost them in terms of bad press and public humiliation, acquisition costs, relocation assistance payments, programs to assist renters to become homeowners, making sure that owners with a zero balance were left with a zero balance after acquisition and relocation, hiring minorities within the highway department, contract set-asides for minorities and women in construction, the trades and supplies, and minority participation in acquisition and reuse of surplus land. If you try to find the neighborhood of Sugar Hill in Los Angeles, you won't find it. Today, it goes by the name West Adams. Its residents have a median income of a little more than half that of the rest of the county. And the county's 209 neighborhoods, West Adams ranks 25th in violent crime with 122 violent crimes per 100,000 residents. But during the heyday of the Harlem Renaissance, Sugar Hill held its own, becoming a mecca of Black wealth and culture on the West Coast. Hattie McDaniel, the first Black actress to win the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress, reigned supreme, holding court at her mansion with the likes of Duke Ellington and Butterfly McQueen. For years, white racists tried to run their Black neighbors off with eviction and nuisance lawsuits. And for years, their Black neighbors succeeded in maintaining their homes and growing their businesses. Ultimately, the neighborhood was destroyed literally by the government. Rather than build the coastal expansion of I-10 south of Sugar Hill, the state built the freeway right through the middle of it. The road could have been built without cutting through the so-called Sugar Hill section, according to an article in the Los Angeles Sentinel reported at the time. However, in order to miss Sugar Hill, it was said that the route would have to cut through Fraternity and Sorority Row at USC. Well, Sorority and Fraternity Row still stands today, and Sugar Hill is no more. So I guess you know who won that battle. Of course, the statement that that was the only viable route for the freeway was a complete lie. The freeway could have been built anywhere within more than a half mile between its current location today and the University of Southern California's Greek Row. Now, those of you who have had any dealings with acquisition for highway building know that they don't just acquire the narrow strip that they need for the road. They acquire a complete corridor. And ODOT, for example, was notorious for the width of the swath of land that they would always acquire for their projects, some as wide as a mile. And then after the freeway was built, all of that land that's left over in Oklahoma went on the auction block to the highest bidder. Well, my argument in the complaint that I filed against them was that instead of that, the community should be given the first right of refusal to buy that surplus land. And I formed an urban nonprofit redevelopment corporation that was given oversight of the 55 block area to carry out and implement the mitigation plan that was put together by us in conjunction with the city, the county, and the state. Chicago has a similar unfortunate story. Following the city's 1919 race riot, Black Chicagoans felt pretty unsafe in vast swaths of the city. And so they coalesced in the neighborhood of Bronzeville, which, like Sugar Hill, became a cultural epicenter. But when the Black Belt grew too populous and too prosperous, the city responded by changing their master housing plan to greatly increase the density of housing allowed in that area. And so they began concentrating more and more Black residents in housing projects that they started building in the area. Unlike the case of Sugar Hill, the Dan Ryan Expressway wasn't built to destroy the neighborhood, according to a famous Chicago documentarian, Arlen Parser, who said it was actually built to calcify existing color lines. Now, what does that mean? Well, the Dan Ryan wasn't built along the originally planned route. The original plans for it called for it to cross the Chicago River almost directly north of Low Avenue, which just happened to be the street that Mayor Daley lived on at the time. And then it was supposed to zigzag for a few blocks and turn south. Well, when the final plans were announced, that wasn't the route at all. If you're familiar with Chicago, then you know that historically, Wentworth Avenue was the dividing line between Black and white neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. And that's where the Dan Ryan was placed. There's a famous story about Langston Hughes having been beaten up for crossing Wentworth Avenue onto the white side of South Chicago. Well, the Dan Ryan fixed that. It has 14 lanes of traffic And in the middle of the 14 lanes, 7 going one direction and 7 on the other, there is the third rail for the L to ride on, right down the middle of the Dan Ryan. So you would have to be an Olympic sprinter in order to be able to climb the fence that prohibits access, to cross the 14 lanes of traffic and not be run over by the L to get to the other side. So that definitely cut off any pedestrian access crossing the old Wentworth corridor. Now, the overwhelming majority of people who lived in that community were Black, and they lacked access to higher income jobs, in large part because of the warehousing approach that Chicago and by fiat, other large cities started to take with how they built housing projects and concentrations of poor people. From Nashville to Miami, the list of highways built in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, and the manner in which they systematically destroy Black and brown neighborhoods is legendary. Turning just briefly to Oakland, California, in 1947, construction commenced on the East Shore Freeway. And with the subsequent addition of a freeway to replace the old East Shore Highway north of the MacArthur Maze in the mid-1950s, it ran almost the entire east shore length of the San Francisco Bay. In 1958, following a joint resolution of the California State Legislature, the portion south of the MacArthur Maze was renamed the Nimitz Freeway in honor of retired World War II Admiral Nimitz, who had retired to the Oakland area. In 1959, he personally cut the ribbon atop the Cypress structure. This was the first double-decker highway structure ever built in California. Adjacent to and partially under the freeway was the site of Oakland's urban renewal or redevelopment housing project, which was called Acorn. It encompassed 50 blocks. Approved in 1959, it was 1962 before any activity moving toward acquisition happened. That was because they had to get past all the complaints and lawsuits that were going on for those few years. 13 West Oakland property owners had sued the city about the project. They told the court they had no objection to urban improvement, but did object to being forcibly moved out of their homes with no place to go and not being able to afford anything. And there was limited housing that Black people could move to in Oakland at that time. The U.S. Court of Appeals in San Francisco ruled against them in May of 1963. And I'll add as a little side note here that no federal courthouse existed in the East Bay all the way from Oakland to Sacramento. If you had business in federal court, you had to go across the Bay Bridge to court in San Francisco. The Oakland Redevelopment Agency by 1967 had spent $13 million, but still no housing in sight. The project was described as a sum clearance project. Well, 4,300 people lost their homes. 13 old Victorians were spared demolition, primarily because several citizens, including some employees of the city of Oakland and the redevelopment agency, chained themselves to the bulldozers and the Victorians in order to save them. So 13, actually there were 27, but 13 of the Victorians were spared, and they were moved to property in downtown Oakland owned by the city. It became Preservation Park and ultimately won national awards for being a nonprofit urban office park. It took from April 1962 to May 1965 to reduce all but 610 of those 4,300 houses and commercial buildings. In their place was acre after acre of empty fields. Construction didn't begin on Acorn for 5 years after the last building was demolished, leaving a giant barren area in the middle of West Oakland, including parts of the historic Black Oakland, 7th Street, which had been home of West Coast Black blues and jazz, later home to hip hop. Even Pete Escobedo, Sheila E.'s father, had a club in West Oakland on 7th Street. That is before the demolition. By the mid-60s, the demolition policies of the Oakland Redevelopment Agency would create deep scars in the Black neighborhood close to downtown. When I arrived from Washington, D.C. in Oakland 2 weeks before the '89 earthquake to take the job as the new redevelopment agency director, I was shocked to see how close the rooftops of some of the housing in the Acorn project were to the bottom deck of the Nimitz Freeway. And when I say some of that housing was under the freeway, I'm not kidding you. I'll quickly finish the side note that I made earlier. As redevelopment agency director, I had the chance to compete for construction of a new federal building. We competed head to head with San Francisco and won the bid. And now I'm proud to say there is a federal courthouse in the East Bay. It's in downtown Oakland. It was the first project that I completed as redevelopment agency director. You likely saw it in the news coverage following George Floyd's death. It was the unfortunate site of the death of a federal law enforcement officer during the demonstrations. Now, after that brief commercial interruption, let me get back to the Nimitz. As I would have expected, noise, dust, exhaust fumes, and trash from the freeway overhead onto the housing below was at inappropriate levels. Yet, that had not even been considered when it was built 20 years earlier. Most notable was the fact that the freeway literally blocked the sun from big portions of the housing development. So for 20 years, people lived in housing under the freeway with no sunshine, and trash and dust and noise plaguing their existence. When the earthquake collapsed, when the upper deck of the earthquake collapsed the freeway onto the lower deck on October 17th, 1989, the neighbors of the inhospitable freeway came out of their houses with ladders and stacked furniture to climb up to help those people trapped between those two collapsed decks of the freeway. They were busy rescuing people when the first responders arrived on the scene. These same people who had been deprived of a noise and air pollution-free environment for 20 years put all of that aside to help their fellow man. Caltrans, that's the California Department of Transportation, wanted to rebuild the Nimitz in the same manner along the same path. But fortunately, the neighborhood rose up against them, this time joined by the redevelopment agency director, the architects, engineers, and public health advocates, and the remaining structure was raised and rebuilt at grade. Now, the route of it was shifted to the west so that it was an appropriate distance from the neighborhood, and it was built with the appropriate noise mitigation methods, berms, sound barriers, and landscaping. The sun on the project finally shone for the first time in 20 years. Commercial and retail activity ignited, and many of the proprietors and entrepreneurs are people of color. It doesn't make up for the forced exodus of the longtime historic businesses when the Nimitz was built, but it certainly is a beginning of some economic parity in the area. In Tennessee, plans for the construction of I-40 were in fact redrawn for the purpose of running it right through the middle of the Jefferson Street corridor, which was home to about 80% of Nashville's African-American owned businesses. Not only did the construction destroy the commercial district, it demolished almost 700 homes and 27 apartment buildings, while erecting physical barriers separating the city's largest African-American universities, Fisk University, Tennessee A&I, and Meharry Medical College. Urban renewal came to be known as urban destruction in Black communities across the country. In Oklahoma City, they even bulldozed down old growth trees and vegetation, causing soil erosion and flooding in the surrounding area. Block after block lay fallow for more than 10 years before anything was built, deflating property values of nearby residents and discouraging any retail development and investment. Even 5 years after Katrina, as I drove and walked the Ninth Ward in NOLA and saw how it had been moonscaped to the degree that you couldn't tell where one property ended and the next property began. If you were a property owner who went back to try to do something with your land, you literally had to have a survey to even find out where your lot had been. This was a device used to dissuade owners of limited means from reclaiming their land and rebuilding, but made it more attractive to large-scale developers. Because of the recent 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race riots, which most, if not all of you, have read about or seen on TV, I'm sure, more attention is being paid to these efforts to destroy communities of color or prevent them from becoming self-sufficient and self-sustaining, from accumulating wealth or destroying generational wealth. In Tulsa, they still don't know how many Blacks were murdered in that massacre. It's believed to be well into the hundreds. Now, after 100 years, a commission has finally been established to investigate it. The silver lining in the George Floyd and all the others wrongfully killed is that finally these atrocities are coming to light. And for the first time in the history of this republic, there is a large-scale opportunity to put these issues on the table and to talk about them openly, to work together to seek healing and to find solutions. For example, did you know that of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 41 of them, either at the time of signing or earlier in their lives, had been slave owners? Ben Franklin's newspaper even ran ads for the slave auctions. There's such hypocrisy and fundamental irony that these men were triumphantly declaring themselves free from what they viewed as the tyranny of King George III, without so much as a thought toward the people who they themselves held in chains in a system that was far more brutal than the 18th century British tax system. The art of the doublespeak has had a long life in America. There's good reason for Black, brown, and red people to fear and mistrust the government. For example, between 1778 and 1878, the federal government signed more than 500 treaties with Indian nations. Every one of them was broken, violated, nullified, or modified to suit the needs of the federal government. I won't even get into the poisoning of water supplies, blankets infected with smallpox and malaria, and numerous other acts that today would in fact meet the definition of war crimes under the Hague and Geneva Conventions. White privilege has had an unspeakably ugly 400+ year history on these shores. In closing, let me say, I don't consider myself naive by any stretch of the imagination. but I continue to be amazed at the many hateful acts performed, even in the name of organized religion. People railing against socialism need to read their Bibles. I view socialism in some ways as an extension of the admonition that we love and care for one another, not being envious of our neighbor and the good fortune that they may have, not using people or taking advantage of them. I really do believe that we are our brother's keeper. Of course, part of the hypocrisy of saying, ooh, socialism is bad, is the fact that we have a social security system. We have Medicare, although not Medicare for all. We have consumer protection laws, laws against child labor and human trafficking, and the Affordable Care Act, just to name a few. Now, our health system still leaves a great deal to be desired in the Western world. And it's beyond shameful that the richest country on the planet has so many people that are homeless, so many people who wake up hungry and go to bed the same way every day. Even here in Doñana County, which does free food distribution in 13 locations across the county. And there are other food pantries and food distribution programs run by nonprofits like Casa de Peregrinos. And still, it's not enough. I was raised to believe that God blessed me with many talents, and my grandmother taught me that my task in life was not to use those talents for self-aggrandizement, but to help others who might not be as fortunate and have had the same opportunities that I've been blessed with. So that's how I've lived my personal life and how I've charted the path for my career choices. At the end of my day, I hope I have helped somebody along my journey. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to join you today, and I hope I've left enough time for questions and discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. Some questions, comments? Yeah. Anyway, I have one, Julia. You know, the pushback that we've gotten recently, by especially the right wing, in regard to bringing up nasty things of our past, whether it's slavery or the way we treated people like George Floyd, so forth and so on, it's really getting bad. What's your reaction?
I completely agree. I think it's unfortunate isn't strong enough a word.
I agree.
But people who don't know their history and all of their history are doomed to repeat those unfortunate mistakes that they make.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the biggest motivating factors behind trying to prevent that history from being told is, they say, because it's making white students feel guilty. Certainly no one wants to make anybody feel guilty. The whole point, for example, of Black Lives Matter is not that Black lives matter to the exclusion of other lives or that they matter more than other lives. It's, I think, sad that they didn't coin the phrase Black Lives Matter too, because that is the whole point of it. And it doesn't, it also hurts children of color and people of color not to know their history.
Yeah.
And when we have a system that is institutionalized racism over centuries, where almost everything you can think of that touches our lives in one way or another has been designed, gerrymandered, twisted, and pretzeled into a system that locks out people who don't look like the historic majority in this country.
Yeah.
And for kids, not just black and brown and red and yellow kids, but white kids too, who don't know the contributions that everybody who came to these shores has made. They're being cheated out of knowing what the fabric that wove this country into existence is really made of. Dave?
Go ahead,
Dave's
David.
hand.
Okay.
Dave, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Julia, for your presentation, and also thank you for all the work that you've been doing throughout your career to try to right some of these wrongs. I think that you've been overly charitable in your characterization of our past history as mistakes made in the past. It's very much like these were not mistakes. These were clearly intentional acts on the part of people in power to take advantage of those who lack power. And I think that we should call it for what it was. These are crimes against our fellow citizens. These are crimes against humanity. And I'll just make one other comment. I was struck by the irony, and that's too small of a word, of what happened in Oklahoma the week that we were commemorating the 100th anniversary of what happened to Black Wall Street in Tulsa. And that same week, the state legislature passed laws restricting what could be taught in the school system about the history of Oklahoma and the relationship between those in power and those disempowered by virtue of their ethnicity and racial heritage. And and I didn't hear people talking a lot about the juxtaposition of those two events. And I just like with the existential threat that we're facing right now, with all of the efforts to change our voting laws and to give a minority group in power the power to overturn elections whose results they don't like. This is, I don't know why we are not out on the streets now protesting across the country what's going on. And I'll get off my soapbox now, but thank you very much for your presentation.
Dave, thank you for your comments. I think there is a time for everything, including a time for protest marches. But I think right now, with all that's going on with voter suppression laws and other legislation and other ugly things that are happening, it's time for some behind closed doors planning and strategizing and putting together tactical operations. And I believe, and I seldom hope that I'm wrong, but I hope I'm wrong about this. I believe things are going to get worse before they get better, because as the numbers shift, as the minorities become the majority in this country, whites who have historically been in power and who believe this crap about the supremacy of the color of their skin are going to become more fearful and are going to get more desperate. And desperate people do the most heinous things in an effort to stay in power and in control.
Dave, go ahead. You had a comment or a question?
Well, this is maybe a small one compared to what Julia just said, but putting our guns aside for a minute, well, currently, as we all know, there's these huge infrastructure bills that are being booted around in Washington, for example. Are there groups, perhaps like you've worked with in your career, who could advise us on what to look out for? Because these are talking about, again, doing the kind of work you alluded with the Nimitz, rebuilding or resiting and relocating these projects, which could be conveniently injurious. And so,
Well, one of the big arguments is that the infrastructure bill should only include brick and mortar things and roads and highways and bridges and the like. I believe when you think about nation building, and I spent quite a number of years in the Army, a large part of it in civil affairs and psychological operations, where the Army does get involved in nation building with our allies. If you think about what it takes to take a third world country and bring it up to a standard of living where people can survive, it's not just roads and bridges and highways that are needed. It's human infrastructure. It's, as an example, I was in an Army Reserve unit and was deployed to Haiti when the rest of the world descended on Haiti to try to rescue it. And Haiti remains the poorest country in the entire Western Hemisphere. And our policies and practices here in this country have helped make it so. Every system in Haiti was broken when we went over there. Now, if somebody who was in charge of the UN deploying the forces and so forth had had the foresight to stage that so that you had one group at a time coming in over a lengthy period of time, basically a sustainment operation of nation building, then it would not have been like trying to give them a drink of water from a high pressure fire hose. It was too much for them to have to absorb. I was on an economics and commerce team at the time. I worked for the Treasury Department, the comptroller of the currency. Haiti didn't even have a currency recirculation policy. Now, if you think about paper money, the longer it stays in circulation, the longer it's handled by people, those bills become dirty. And over time, if they're out there long enough, they transmit diseases. Haiti had no currency recirculation policy. Their currency had been in circulation since it was printed. It was so old and so worn. And the only good thing about it was each denomination was printed with a different color ink. And so you could see a little spot of yellow or a little spot of red or a little spot of blue or a little spot of green left. That was all that was left on the bills to know what the denomination was. We set up a currency recirculation program for them, took that money out of circulation, and at Main Treasury in Washington, D.C., printed new currency for them, which we then transported back so that they could put it back into the system. But the hospital had no clean water. Every day, the doctors and nurses were taking up money to buy bottled water to bring in for the patients and to try to sterilize things. Now, I bring that up as an example because there are communities in this country that are just like that. Indian country, the Mississippi Delta, Appalachia, a lot of rural areas in this country, a lot of rural areas in Doña Ana County are not faring much better. And so it's not just the road that needs to be built. It is human infrastructure that needs to be built as well.
Take care.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Comment, question?
Yes, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Julia, I don't know if it was true at the time of Sugar Hill or not, but in Detroit, people started objecting to just taking land. And so they passed a law that said that homeowners had to be reimbursed for the value of their home. So what the land development would do, the road construction development, is threaten an area. They would let it be known that they were considering building something in this area, and so the housing values dropped precipitously. And in fact, people moved out just on the threat. And so 5 years later, they could go in and buy the land for next to nothing and do what they wanted to do in the first place. Did that happen in Sugar Hill too?
It did, and in other places across the country, it even today, it's still not uncommon to see speculators going door to door with cash, offering people a rock bottom price, and literally scaring them. And it's kind of like the reverse of blockbusting, where people would go in to frighten white homeowners and say, colored people are getting ready to come into your neighborhood. You need to go ahead and sell now because your value is going to be down to nothing. And I can give you cash today. Well, the opposite of that happens in communities of color where a freeway project or a big box retail project is coming in. And it's also further complicated by the fact, now not Sugar Hill, but a lot of places, Black and brown people don't own their land. Oklahoma and a lot of other places used to have a law called contract for deed. And when I was at Legal Services in Oklahoma, I encountered fourth generations of families who were still paying on a contract for deed. And you don't get the deed until the final payment is made. And if there's a late payment, it starts all over again from the beginning. It took us 5 years fighting with the Oklahoma legislature to finally get that law removed from the books, because nobody lived long enough to actually own the land. They had paid for the house 5 and 6 times over by the fourth generation. And when the highway came through, they got, ODOT proposed to give them zip because they didn't own the land. The absentee slumlord owned the land. But part of what we were able to negotiate in that one project was enough of a relocation package for renters and people like that, coupled with first-time down payment assistance from the city so that they could become homeowners. And then they weren't at risk 3 years later after they had spent all the relocation money of becoming homeless, because that happens a lot to people also.
That was incredibly creative. And, every time I hear Julia speak and I learn more of her story and history, I keep thinking we need a whole lot more elected leaders like Julia Brown to really do something significant to solve these problems, which are, as she has demonstrated, are solvable.
Well, I can't take all the credit for that. As it turned out, there was a law on the books in Oklahoma that had been on the books for more than 20 years, had never been used. And I happened to cross it by accident when I was trying to figure out a way to rein in the Urban Renewal Authority. It was in the same law. It allowed for the establishment of a private nonprofit urban redevelopment corporation, basically a private urban renewal authority. And the law gave it all of the power that the renewal authority had, except the power of eminent domain. Well, by contracting with the renewal authority, we got the power of eminent domain. And I said, man, they must have been on drugs the day they passed this bill, because I know they didn't realize what they were passing.
Well, it was a happy accident that you came along and discovered that incredible loophole in that bill.
Yeah, we got the same problem in this state. We still got these payday loans.
Oh, and both sides of the aisle at the Roundhouse are keeping that law in place.
It's just crazy. Just, 300, 400% interest. Give me a break.
Oh, actually, those are the low ones. I've seen some that were 1,500% interest. And I've worked with some people that have 8 loans at one time.
Oh, wow.
Because they borrow one to make the payments on the other. And that loan program, the business model for those loans is set up to recycle those loans every 45 days, every 30 days if you can, so that the principal's never paid off. You just keep rolling it.
Yeah.
People go in to make a payment and they say, Julia, what if I could tell you to put that money back in your purse today? And you're like, what do you mean? Well, I can fix you up so that we take care of this month's payment, but you can still keep it in your pocket and you don't have to pay anything until next month. We'll just roll it on over. And people don't understand what that means.
Yeah.
That sound good to you? Yeah, here, just sign right here.
I thought we got a cap on predatory loans
No,
2 years
they
ago.
hoped to, but they didn't.
No, Paul, 2 years ago, they brought it down to 135%.
Right.
Well, yeah,
This time they were trying to lower it even more, and that
trying
didn't go
to
through.
get it down to, I think, 36.
36%.
36.
35 or something. I was thinking of the 35, not, they did, some
But
state
a lot of
legislature.
those companies restructured themselves so that they're not payday lenders and they are now some other financial services.
Oh,
So they're not subject to that cap.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Crooks try to find a way, don't they?
Yeah.
They do. They are up while we're sleeping. They're up thinking of more ways to gouge, to get a little more blood out of that turnip.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Jack, you got a question? Oh,
You're muted.
you're muted.
I know an individual that was caught up in that payday loan business, and he told me that every time he went in, they would not take his money. They made it difficult. They made it difficult for him to pay off, just as Julia pointed out. So I'm confirming that.
And really, when you think about how the typical bank, commercial bank, deals with a poor person or a person who has never had a checking or savings account and really has not been in the financial services mainstream, it's very different than how the payday lender treats them when they come in. Oh, they've got homemade cookies and lemonade and coffee, and they know you by your first name. And it's like, come on in this house. I got something for you.
Mhm.
And banks are frightening, scary places to a lot of poor people.
Yeah, they should be.
And
it's not just poor people though, Julia. It's people of color, especially because the banks assume that you're not going to be able to pay your loan. And so white privilege gets us loans at reasonable rates through our banks and credit unions, but people of color are denied that.
well, the old joke about who the bank makes loans to, those who don't need it.
Yeah,
Those who don't.
right. And that's why whites can own homes and blacks and black and brown have to rent because they can't get a mortgage.
Yeah, well, we're getting close to the finish here. Anyone else have something, or I'll talk about what we got next week? Okay,
I'd like to ask Julia, just practically, what can we do next time around when the legislature is in session to influence them, both sides taking this seriously about passing legislation that does deal with the payday loans?
If they are really, a couple of things. If they are really fully open and they're having actual committee hearings instead of virtual hearings, my recommendation would be to take busloads of people to the Roundhouse, to those hearings, and to the offices of the legislators. But even before that, we need to get the list of the people who voted against putting the cap on, and they need to be targeted. We don't need to wait until they come back in session. Wherever they are going to have pre-legislative hearings, and I think it's wonderful that they do that in different places throughout the state, because it really does give people in communities an opportunity to see them up close and personal and to hear the testimony and presentations at those local hearings. But they need to be confronted at those local hearings. We need to fill the chambers of wherever they're meeting with people who have got horror stories about what is happening to disrupt and destroy their lives with these payday loans.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. Let's give her a big hand.
Thank you all. And thank you for all that you're doing. Just the act of having these presentations so that people can share information and the free flowing of ideas to spark and ignite thoughts and solutions for these things is fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, next week, at the request of Jan, I'm going to talk about why we always have money for things like tax cuts and defense, but not for things like human infrastructure and getting rid of student loans and all those sort of things. And I have read this book here, The Debt Myth, and I'll be summarizing that, and I've put a fair amount of time into it. So it'll be a very interesting discussion. And so I look forward to it. Thank you, Jan. I looked, this book is very good.
My favorite economist.
Really?
Yeah, you are my favorite economist.
Okay. Anyway, I did talk to Jim Peach about this also, and he said it's he goes along with us. So I was very pleased that we had a long discussion about it. I just wanted to make sure my fellow economists knew about it. And so anyway, I'm looking forward to it, and we'll have a good discussion.
Great.
So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Julia.
Enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
Thank
All
you,
right.
everyone. Have a great day.
All right.